My Facebook life is my only life, actually, so I don't even have the mismatch between them. So, hello, everybody. My name's James. A real pleasure to be here this afternoon. I understand, obviously, that you've all just come from lunch, and so you're feeling like just settling back in. Thought we would start off with a little bit of Mozart. So, this is actually one of my favorite pieces of music. It's called Miserere. It's by a composer called Allegri. And it used to be sung in the Sistine Chapel in Rome. But it was the ultimate piece of proprietary closed source, because for 150 years, no one ever performed it outside of the Sistine Chapel, and the choir had been sworn to secrecy, and the manuscript was kept under lock and key, etc., etc. And that was until, I think, 1770, when a young child went to hear the service, evening service, heard this amazing piece of music and said, I want other people to be able to hear this music. And so that teenager listened and remembered every note that was sung, and that evening when he got back to his room, sat down with a piece of manuscript and basically wrote the music out as he'd remembered it. Took it to London, published it, it became famous, and ever since then, hundreds of millions of people have listened to this piece of music and been touched by it and have enjoyed it. So of course the kid was Mozart. Not everybody is able to remember long, complex pieces of music and write them down, but he did. And in a sense, he's like the first open source hacker, in my opinion. He took this piece of closed source and made it available to the rest of the world so that millions of people could benefit from it. So in a humble way, this helps us at Facebook, it helps motivate me at least to think about what we do at Facebook that we can help to share with the world and in some way help to make it a better place. Open has always beaten closed. Being connected has always beaten being isolated, and sharing has always trumped secrecy. And we have a lot of infrastructure, we have a lot of technology that we've built ourselves and that we've used from other people, and we're always looking for how to get it back out into the world. So just to kind of give you a sense of scale as to what I'm talking about here, the open source program that I have responsibility for is currently running at about 234 projects. In fact, we launched another one this morning, so that's already out of date. 235 open source projects, most of which you can find on GitHub. And we have now well over 10 million lines of code that we've open sourced. On GitHub, we have over 150,000 followers or stars, and we have 26,000 forks. So these are projects that people are finding valuable, that they're finding useful, that they can take on and help build their own businesses with, or use in their infrastructure, or what have you. The little clicker doesn't work. Yes, it does. So there's my obligatory Steve Jobs sparkle. This is just a list of the projects that we launched in the last 6 months. So in the second half of 2014, we launched something like 64 projects, something like that. And I think what's really interesting about this is not just the quantity of projects that we open source, but the diversity of them. We have such a mix in here. It's really, it's exciting. There's data infrastructure, there's web infrastructure, there's web front-end tooling, there's mobile in the form of mobile libraries, mobile tooling, developer infrastructure, the Open Compute project, obviously, which we helped to kick off way back in the day. And we even open sourced the firmware and schematics for the Oculus DK1 headset, which we felt was something that the world could probably benefit from looking at. So it's a huge range of stuff, and it's really exciting. For me personally, I get this sort of opportunity to look at code from all over the business and looking at all of these different types of community, and that's really, really, an exciting and very fulfilling personal aspect to this program. But to back up a bit, I wanted to talk a little bit about why we do open source at all. And the reason really is that we built Facebook on open source right from day zero. So when Mark was sitting in his dorm room deciding that he wanted to build a new website, he could have chosen the Microsoft stack, I guess, but really the only other choice was to go open source. So he went with Linux, he went with Apache, he went with MySQL, and yes, he went with PHP. So built on a classic LAMP stack, Facebook from the very start was a classic open source success story. And now we benefit from open source as much as we ever have, but fortunately, we're a little bit larger. We are not now just one engineer, and we have many, many hundreds, if not thousands of engineers who are able to contribute back to the open source world. And we see this cycle happening over and over again. What we tend to do is, before we build anything, we look at the open source opportunities that would help us to fulfill those requirements. And we try them out. And one of the things about Facebook, of course, is that we do things at a certain scale. We have quite a few users, we have quite a few data centers, we have quite a few machines that we run. And so what often happens is that when we put these technologies out into deployment, into production, we kind of face a whole lot of new challenges that perhaps the original software wasn't designed for. But we don't give up, so we work hard to try to improve those. We look hard to take them beyond the original boundary parameters. Sometimes, occasionally, we have to kind of rip it out and replace it with something equivalent, but which does work. But the important part is we make sure we release it back to the world. And this story, as I've said, happens over and over again. Whether it was that initial decision to use PHP, which we quickly discovered wouldn't scale. So we built our own web server infrastructure to run PHP, and in turn adapted PHP to form a new language, Hack. Or whether it's the work that we've done with MySQL to improve that to operate at our scale, whether it's the hardware, whether it's any of these other aspects. JavaScript even, we've taken off-the-shelf JavaScript libraries. They weren't good enough. We had to come up with our own slightly unconventional solution, which we called React. So this cycle happens over and over again. But the important part is this final arrow, and we're absolutely committed to this. Because if you don't continue to use what you've open sourced, you may as well just have thrown it over the wall and forgotten all about it. And many companies have fallen into that trap. We ourselves have fallen into that trap. But if you want an open source program or project to be successful, continuing to use it yourself is of utmost importance. Another reason that we find open source very valuable is that it's just part of our culture. It aligns well with our hacker culture. This is our campus. We even have the word hack built into the courtyard, which you can see from space, apparently. No, that's not true. But you can see it from Google Maps, at least. And we take our kind of hacker culture very seriously. We're a very engineering-led organization. And really, the open source philosophy fits very, very well with that. And we think that it helps people to think of Facebook in a positive light when they think about our engineering as well. And in fact, many of our new engineers that join the company cite the open source work that we do as a good reason to want to join Facebook at all. At least 2/3 of the people that join the company have been aware of our program before they joined, and at least half of them have said that when they decided which job they were going to take, they chose Facebook because of the open source work that we've been doing. So it's been really fantastic in terms of helping people to become more aware of the work that we do inside. And here's another little secret, which actually turns out to be one of the biggest wins for us. When people join the company and they are using technology that they are already familiar with because it's been open sourced previously, they are able to become effective much, much more quickly. If you have to wait 6 months for an engineer to get trained up on some proprietary internal system, that's time wasted. And engineers' salaries being what they are, that all adds up. So if we can get engineers coming into Facebook who are already familiar with React or with HHVM or with the work that we've been doing on our data infrastructure, that's a huge win because they can become effective much quicker. Finally, we think that open sourcing our software just means that we write better code. One of my colleagues uses the expression or the saying that open source is like the breeze from an open window. Because we know we're going to open source things, it means that we put our own code under much more scrutiny. We make sure that the APIs are all super clean. We make sure that it's really, really modular. We make sure that it doesn't have its tendrils stretched throughout other parts of the architecture that it shouldn't do. And it also, of course, ends up meaning that more people see our code, and we can ensure that it's of better quality. And that's even before we start getting contributions back in from the community, which is obviously also a nice aspect. So yeah, it just makes us write better software, which is absolutely awesome. But as I said, it's not always been white rooms and light. If you had looked at our GitHub repos even a year ago or 2 years ago, you'd have seen some disastrous-looking projects. This was 320, which was one of our first open source projects from back in 2007 or so. And it was an iOS library, and it had thousands of followers, and yet we discontinued it, and had just left it lying there with no kind of statement about what its future was and what we were planning to do with its governance. If you had looked at our PHP SDK, you would have seen again, that we had deprecated it, but just left it there with no statement about what was going to happen in the future. And if you had looked at our fork of memcache, you would have seen that the description of the project was test. And you would have seen that the last commit was 6 and 7 years ago, respectively. So, you know, these things were huge projects at the time, and yet we had just completely neglected them and they had died. And as I said, you know, if you consider open source to be the act of just throwing software over the wall, you may as well have thrown something else over the wall, because a community that sees you behaving like that with your software is not going to start using this stuff. Well, they might start using it, and then they're going to get very disillusioned when you don't appear to continue to support and maintain it. So as I always say to my teams that are open sourcing stuff, like when they've launched it and they've got lots of Hacker News excitement and Twitter love, and they feel very proud of themselves, it's like, no, that was the easy part, right? That's day zero. That's super, super easy. The hard part starts now, keeping these projects going and keeping the community engagement high. And so over the last 18 months, we've tried to be really, really disciplined about this. And I'll talk a little bit about how we did that. So about 18 months ago, we didn't even have an open source team. I was at the company, but I was doing something completely separate. And I could see that this open source portfolio was just kind of a disaster. It was kind of a problem that no one really seemed to own. One of the amazing things about Facebook is that if you see a problem somewhere else in the business and you think you've got the ambition to go and solve it, you can just go and do it. There is no management involved. If you spot something that you think you can do to improve Facebook, go ahead and do it. So I did that. I took them at their word, and I said, OK, I'll take over the open source program and see what we can do with it. So we tried to reboot it, got a small team together, and looked to see whether we could get things back under control. First thing I needed to do was find out what we had. What had we open sourced? What was going well? Very little. What was going badly? Lots. So the good news was everything was on GitHub. And the other good news about GitHub, of course, is it has a fantastic API. So the first thing I did was I wrote a script, and it pinged the API, and it pulled data about every repo, it pulled data about every commit, it pulled data about every pull request and every issue, and basically tried to bring as much of that, a mirror of as much of that metadata in well, as it started off just on my development machine, to see where we were. And stuck it all in a database. As I like to say, we do have some database capacity at Facebook, so we used it for this. And what happened is once we'd put all of that data into MySQL, as it happened, we could start to see very quickly how these projects were doing. And so we tracked the number of followers for each project, the number of forks, the number of commits, the number of issues, and the number of pull requests. And I like to say that GitHub is fantastic. They have an amazing, amazing platform, which we absolutely rely on. But sometimes their UI can be a little unwieldy, especially when you've got 250 projects or something. So actually being able to query it out of a database is kind of a nifty trick, and it makes it very easy for us to see what's doing well and what isn't. And you can see which projects are supposedly doing well and yet which have got a big load of issues or pull requests backing up. And that can be like a big red warning sign to us that something is wrong. The one I like to point out is the one 3 from the bottom there called animation, which had 0 followers, 0 forks, 0 commits, 0 pull requests, and 1 issue. And I think we can all guess what that issue might have been. I think it was something like, where's the code? So anyway, using techniques like this, I was quickly able to start tracking this data. I figured, well, if I can do it once, I can do it over and over again. And so we started pulling this data every day. And in fact, now we are pulling this data every minute. We have a big suite of scripts that run and sync as much of this data about all 250 projects from GitHub on a minute-by-minute basis, which of course means I can draw graphs. And this, for example, is the chart over time of our GitHub following. And what's really interesting about this is that then we can start to gauge whether the way in which we're behaving with the community and the way in which we're behaving with the outside world is good or bad, because we can start to see the impact that we're having in terms of followers. Followers are not the only metric that we track, but it's one that allows us to judge that causality. And at this scale, really, applying metrics and applying empiricism to it is really the only choice we have. And it also means that I can do more to communicate internally what's going well and what isn't. These 2 bumps are simultaneous, each when we open sourced some iOS libraries, one in March, one in April, and which that gave us a big kind of push in terms of new communities that were coming on board and looking at the sort of the work that we do. So we have a saying at Facebook, which is that code wins arguments. If you're ever in a debate with somebody, just sit down and write some code, and if you're right, then the code will prove it. And if you're wrong, too bad, at least you gave it a shot. It's part of the hacker culture, right? But as well as code winning arguments, data wins arguments. And by plotting our progress along this open source trajectory through the use of metrics and through the use of numbers, we've been able to kind of get much more discipline about the way that we run the program. And because I'm escalating these metrics and doing reports to engineers and their managers and their directors, like the sense that all of this stuff is more valuable and the sense that this stuff is all more organized is actually really helping to move this snowball forward. So actually, it turns out there are 5 metrics that we found have been very, very successful in terms of tracking the success of the program. The number of followers per repo, per project, the average number of forks per repo, the average pull request age, the average issue age, and the number of external commits, or rather, the ratio of external to internal commits. So the first 2 are fairly self-explanatory. They're like the top of the funnel, like we're getting people interested in these projects, and then as they gradually become contributors and committers, they kind of like whittle away. But it gives us an early indicator that a project is popular or interesting. The pull request age and issue age, we go for an average there of the age rather than the absolute number of pull requests, because actually having lots of pull requests on a repo is a great sign that it's healthy. Having lots of issues on a repo is a great sign that it's healthy because people are trying it and they're having trouble and they're filing the challenges that they're having. Leaving those open for a very long time, on the other hand, is not. And that's something we've really worked hard to do, is to triage that stuff as quickly as possible. And finally, the external commit ratio between external and internal commits, that's extremely important for us. And the reason is that the projects that we release and that we launch, we don't think that they will always be Facebook projects. I mean, many of them have a stated goal to go off and become community governance projects, which might be at the point at which we feel the community is owning the project more than we are. And that's probably time to let it fly the nest. And so tracking that metric kind of gives us a clue that, OK, now we're at a tipping point. Now the community is leading this more than we are. And we will step back and become just another user like everybody else. And a couple of our high-profile projects are reaching that point, and now we need to figure out how to hand those off to the community effectively. Internally, we have a dashboard that anyone in the company can look at, and this is, again, where we plot all of those metrics, and so people can see the number of repos and the number of forks are going, and we set goals for each of the teams. Again, it's all kind of fun, basic, data-driven management. Another thing that I found has been extremely important is establishing ownership. Because if an individual starts a project and then leaves the company, the thing just stagnates. So what we've done is kind of keep a very, very strict audit of who is which employee is owning each project, and if they leave the company, a little red light comes on, and then I can work hard to either hand that off to the community or find some other owner for it. Because if there's no one that I can go and tap on the shoulder of to say, why is your project going bad, then it's just going to go bad. And again, this is the dashboard where we're tracking the ratio of commits from employees versus non-employees. This is the React project. And again, we can start to see when we're reaching that tipping point. In the case of React, it's about 2/3 of the commits coming from us. It varies from month to month, but it's either between 1/2 and 2/3 of the commits coming from us, and the remainder coming from the community. So that is getting quite mature, and we're very excited about it. Like I said, there are hundreds of engineers at Facebook working on open source, and none of them, I have no management authority over any of them. So how do I get them to behave? And it turns out that gamification is the secret. So because I've got all this tooling and I've got all these metrics, I can start to play teams off against each other. And one of the things that we noticed happening in about October last year was that 2 of our flagship projects, HHVM and React, were both reaching roughly 10,000 stars on GitHub. It's like, OK. Again, we're not totally optimizing for the number of stars on GitHub, but still, like, this seems too coincidental to be true. So we actually got the 2 teams to compete to see who could get to 10,000 stars first, and that meant that they engaged in their community, they jumped on Twitter, they talked about all the cool stuff that was happening, and in the end, React got there just in front of HHVM. But that's just a kind of an anecdote that kind of gives you an idea of how we can use this data, because we're doing this stuff at such scale. We can use this statistical data to try to help motivate engineers to be good stewards of their projects. And in fact, just yesterday, we had a 3rd project breakthrough, which actually got there quicker than all the rest of them. This is one of our iOS projects, which is basically a physics engine for iOS devices. Turns out the iOS community is not used to being given stuff for free. So when you give them stuff for free, they get very excited. So POP has been very, very successful in a very short time, and we're proud about that too. Just quickly, I wanted to touch on that pull request age thing. I just want to give you a sense of how bad things were. Can I point with the laser here? No, the laser doesn't work. It goes forwards. There isn't a laser on here. So this is a this is a graph of the pull request age as a function of time from the end of 2013 till today. So I don't know if you can see the left-hand axis. It's way too small, I'm sorry, but the 250 line is the one at the top there. So we were leaving our pull requests open on average for almost a year across all of our projects. And some of them are getting dealt with very quickly, so by the nature of averages, like some of them were lying out there for years. And I guarantee if you want to annoy a community, you get them to write software for you, and then you don't look at it for 2 years. And we had some very disillusioned communities who felt they were doing all this work, and yet the pull requests just weren't getting dealt with. So we've really fought hard to bring that down. And we're now at the point where like a pull request on average takes around 3 months to land, less than 3 months to land, which is not fantastic, but it's still a lot better, and that has started to become a sort of a runaway chain reaction as well. So that's very, very positive. Just very briefly wanted to touch on a point I mentioned earlier. We know that each of these projects has a different destiny. Some of them are going to go off to become projects of their own out in the community, and we will hand them off maybe to a foundation, maybe to some other community organization. Some of them we are committed to bring back upstream to maybe the thing that we originally forked them from. Some of them perhaps were only ever destined to be a snapshot. And some of them we're just going to deprecate and archive off. But the point is we're super explicit about what the end game is for each of these projects. And we don't just let them amble off into the distance. Like we're very, very clear about what we want these things to do, and I make sure the engineers are clear as to how they should behave in each of these different, as they traverse this state machine. But I've talked so far about stuff that we've had internally that we have released to the outside world. And of course, that's only one side of the story. Because this virtuous circle of using, scaling, improving, and then committing back, works for external projects that we use as well as it does for the internal ones that we've launched. Good examples might include Mercurial, where we've put a huge amount of effort and really, really improved things recently. A whole load of the data infrastructure from Apache, which we totally rely on. Even grep. But obviously, the canonical example that I want to talk about today is the kernel, because we've really, over the last year, 18 months, made the same kind of reboot and really started to invest in helping get our efforts on the kernel back out to the community. Again, just to kind of give you a sense of how things were before and after. So from 2008 to 2013, we had like a tiny handful of people, and the team would change, who were sort of responsible for the kernel and the kernel at Facebook. And really, it was a constant firefight. There was no motivation to get stuff updated. We had different versions on different tiers all over our infrastructure. I think we had 2.638, and we had 3.2. These were versions that were like at best a year old, and at worst more than 2 years old at any given time. And we have a philosophy of fix it first, just panic, get things fixed, and sometime later we'll figure out how to upstream it, which of course would rarely happen, because it's so hard to forward port stuff. And it was not a particularly good situation. We couldn't keep this afloat, but because we had this sort of rebirth of open source at Facebook in general, it made it much easier for us to argue to put together a proper team to look after the kernel and our contributions properly. These are the mugshots of all 12 of them, and we have Matthew and Chris are actually in the audience somewhere. If you can find 2 people in the room here that match to any 2 of those pictures, good luck to you. They're in the room. But we have now a team of 12 super folks working on the kernel. And the sheer talent of this team has really given us an opportunity to reboot our contributions and help improve things. So now, as of 2014 and presently, we have 12 people. We have a structured adoption program for getting new versions rolled out to the production tiers. We are now like almost 3/4 running on 3.10. We have a much easier process, backporting patches. We have hundreds of thousands of hosts running on these newer versions, and we're really continuing to push on that. I think the goal is to get to 3.18 this year and get up onto mainline as soon as possible for nearly all of our machines. And the important thing, I think, is that now we can upstream first. This is super important. It's much easier for us to do this. It's almost as quick now as it would have been for us to have had an internal fork. Sometimes we'll try a patch out internally and we'll run it on some canaries, or we'll rerun production traffic against them. But that's all happening whilst we're getting the patch ready for submission upstream. Like upstream is the primary goal right from the start. And that's far preferable for us than having made a massive internal fork that then takes hundreds of people to maintain and shuttling patches back and forth. That's no fun for anybody, right? So it's much more enjoyable for the team, and it's much more fast and efficient and contemporary for us to go upstream first. And we've also got to the point to where hardware vendors, when they're giving us stuff, we can enforce that comes mainline ready, so all the drivers are ready to go straight away, and we don't have to spend ages waiting for them to get drivers that run against some weird old configuration we have. And we recently moved all of our drivers from 3.10 up onto mainline, and I'm told that the team never wants to go back. I mean, the fact that we now have hardware that comes with all the drivers ready to go for, like I said, hundreds of thousands of servers is like a huge, huge win for us. And again, graphs, I love graphs. So this is the sheer number of committers. In the last year, we've got obviously now well over 10 committers that are making contributions to the kernel. But more importantly, the number of commits itself, which has basically gone from nothing to quite a lot. So 229 commits, I think we had in 2014, which to many of you may not sound like a big absolute number for a company the size of Facebook. But when in 2013 we had 6 commits, and that's, I don't know, 4,000% improvement, I'll take it. So we're making it, this is a good inflection. We're really excited about the trajectory, and we really want to move things forward. Because there is a lot more ahead of us. We have a bunch of areas in the kernel that we want to work on. We are continuing to grow the team. We've got this working now like clockwork. We're really trying to get involved with the community, helping sponsor events, take part in advisory boards and so forth. And we're even setting up a lab where we're going to try and run a whole load of kind of exotic hardware, and we can run mainline and our own patches against this hardware, and we're trying to figure out how we can get some of that data back out to the community as well. So as the Facebook motto goes, this journey is only 1% finished. We have a huge amount that we think we can continue to do to help out the kernel. But I just wanted to finish with one final thought about the open source program as a whole, which is that at one end we have hardware. So this is open compute, and we have data infrastructure, and we have query engines and security infrastructure, and a web server, and language tools, and test and build frameworks, and view layers on web and on iOS, and physics engines even. Let alone design tools. We have this huge spread of products and projects that we work on open sourcing. But there's one thing missing from this slide, right? Which is an operating system. And the reason that we haven't open sourced an operating system is because you already have one, and it's amazing. And we're really thrilled to be able to work with you as a community, because Linux and the community and the ecosystem that you've built up makes all of this possible, and we're just thrilled to play a small part in any way we can. So I want to say thank you very much for letting us be involved. Thank you very much for all the work you've done as a community, and we hope we can do you proud in contributing back. Thank you very much for letting me take you on this journey today. Thanks.